Long ago in ancient Persia, there was a king known as Shahryar. He was happy and content until one day he started on a long journey. Shortly after he left his palace, he realized that he had left something behind. When he returned to his rooms, he discovered his wife in bed with the palace cook. Furious with her, he cut both his wife and the cook into pieces with his sword. Shortly afterwards, convinced that all women were traitors, he vowed to spend each night with a new virgin, whom he would execute the following morning. He believed that this would be the only way to avoid betrayal. This went on until there were almost no more virgins in the kingdom to be brought to him. At this point, the daughter of the king's chief advisor volunteered to spend the night with the king, with a plan to bring the nightly executions to an end. Her father protested, fearing for her life, but she insisted. Her name was Scheherazade. So begins the collection of stories known as 1001 Nights. This collection, also known as the Arabian Nights in the West, uses the story of King Shahryar and Scheherazade as a frame story, as a kind of umbrella for hundreds of other stories. 1001 Nights raises a whole new set of questions for our general discussion of mythology. In several lectures, I've argued that story traditions that are explicitly religious and theological should be brought under the general umbrella of mythology, given their significance as cultural meaning-making stories. 1001 Nights is at the opposite end of the spectrum. There's virtually no religious content whatsoever. But I'd like to persuade you that an overwhelmingly secular text can be viewed as mythology as well. We can't possibly discuss all of the stories found in the Arabian Nights collection, but a few stories stand out for various reasons. First, the frame story itself has become well known around the world. As I mentioned, the chief advisor or vizier's daughter, Scheherazade, becomes the king's wife. He takes her to bed for one night. Afterwards, anticipating her execution the following morning, Scheherazade asks the king if she might say goodbye to her sister before she is executed. The king allows this, and her sister, as prearranged, asks Scheherazade to tell her a story. The king hangs around to listen, and he becomes enthralled with the story. But Scheherazade interrupts her narration before the story has finished, claiming that the sun is up, and so the night is over. One translation reads, "Here Scheherazade perceived the light of morning and discontinued the recitation with which she had been allowed thus far to proceed. Her sister said to her, 'How excellent is your story, how pretty and how pleasant and how sweet.' But Scheherazade answered, 'This is nothing in comparison with what I will tell you tomorrow night, if I live and the king spare me.' And the king said, 'By Allah, I will not kill her until I hear the remainder of her story.' So they pleasantly passed the night until the morning, when the king went forth to his hall of judgment, and the vizier went out from the palace with the grave clothes under his arm. And the king gave judgment, and invested and displaced until the close of day, without informing the vizier what had happened, and the minister was greatly astonished. The court was then dissolved, and the king returned to the privacy of his palace." The following night, Scheherazade completes her first story, but then she starts another one, again being careful not to finish it before sunrise. She's not stupid. And this strategy continues for 1001 nights. It's the ultimate cliffhanger approach to storytelling. The story about Scheherazade is actually not the only frame story in 1001 Nights. Several of the stories in the collection also provide frames for other stories. The anthology becomes somewhat complicated, with layer after layer of story, nesting groups of stories within one another. Every night, Scheherazade tells the king a new story, so these individual tales are embedded in the overarching story about Scheherazade. In addition, within these individual tales, we're often presented with a character who, in turn, begins to tell another character a story, and so on. We've seen this structure before in the Mahabharata, for example. But in 1001 Nights, the overall frame story is truly distinct from the smaller independent story units. None of the characters in the short, self-contained stories appears in Scheherazade's story. Because of this, there was no limit on the number of stories in the collection, and as a result, the number grew over time. The original anthology, dating to about the mid-8th century CE, contained only about 300 stories. All of these stories have roots in Persian and ancient Indian oral traditions and folklore. Arab stories were gradually added between the 8th and the 13th century CE. And finally, folk tales from Syria and Egypt were included. The oldest surviving version of the collection is really only a fragment, a document that includes the title, The Book of the Story of 1000 Nights. Two main manuscript traditions exist in Arabic, a Syrian tradition and an Egyptian tradition. The Syrian manuscript is older, but it includes fewer stories, and these stories tend to be shorter. The Egyptian tradition is much broader in scope. The enduring popularity of 1001 Nights is surely due in significant part to the sheer entertainment value of its stories. They include adventures, romance, fantasy, mystery, suspense, and sexual humor. Now, many of the storylines in 1001 Nights are already familiar to you. In part, this is because some of the stories have circulated widely. The Walt Disney Company, of course, has made a mint off of the Aladdin story, which is traditionally found in the Arabian Nights collection. You'll remember that Aladdin, a poor boy, becomes the owner of a magic lamp that produces a genie who is obligated to do whatever the lamp owner wishes. Aladdin becomes rich and powerful. Well, in the original Arabian folktale, Aladdin is in China, and he has to fight off an evil sorcerer who tries to get his hands on the lamp. But in the end, all is well. As an aside, several of the stories, including the Aladdin story, were not part of the original Arabic collection of stories. The story of Aladdin was included in the French version of the collection, edited by Antoine Galland, who claimed he had heard the story from a Syrian storyteller. Galland's diary records when he translated the story into French, and he published the story in the early 1700s, 10 centuries after the original stories first appeared under the title The Thousand Nights. Thereafter, however, Aladdin's story was included by European translators and editors, and it's now part of every canonical version of the collection. The Adventures of Sinbad were probably a late addition, but they currently make up a large section of the collection, and they are quintessential examples of the 1001 Nights stories. Sinbad the Sailor, who is now an old man, describes his past adventures as a young man. The elderly, rich Sinbad narrates his adventures in the first person to a young errand boy he meets who's resting on a bench, bemoaning how unfair the world is and how unjust it is that the rich live in comfort while he works so hard. Now, this young man, who's poor, happens to be named Sinbad as well. The older Sinbad attempts to instruct the young man in the form of 7 distinct stories, and they all follow the same structure. Almost every adventure starts with the same opening. When I returned to the city of Baghdad and met my companions and my family and my friends, and was enjoying the utmost pleasure and happiness and ease, and had forgotten all that I had experienced by reason of the abundance of my gains, and had become immersed in sport and mirth, and the society of friends and companions, leading the most delightful life, my wicked soul suggested to me to travel again to the countries of other people, and I felt a longing for associating with the different races of men and for selling and gains. At the beginning of his first adventure, Sinbad leaves Baghdad and travels to Basra, both of which are real cities located in present-day Iraq. He then sets sail, traveling as far away as India. It's clear that the stories of his 7 adventures draw from other traditions. For example, In one story cycle, Sinbad is captured by a giant who traps the sailors by day, returning at night to eat them one at a time. Sinbad comes up with the idea of heating a hot metal rod and blinding the giant and then escaping. This works, but other challenges arise, and by the end of the adventure, Sinbad is the only survivor. It's clear that the Sinbad adventure borrows from Odysseus' adventures with the Cyclops in the Greek epic The Odyssey. We'll see that the literary influences go both ways. Sometimes 1001 Nights borrows from earlier literary traditions. At other times, 1001 Nights provides the basis for subsequent stories. We'll talk more about that later. At the end of his first adventure, Sinbad the sailor is eventually returned to his hometown with all his wealth intact. He praises Allah and gives thanks for all the blessings he has received, until he's struck with wanderlust again. A pattern develops. Sinbad is happy for a time, but his wicked soul encourages him to travel. So he leaves Baghdad and sails off somewhere, usually in search of adventure and trading commerce. Some horrible calamity befalls him, but he's able to escape. There's a clear Muslim backdrop to all the Sinbad stories, which is most clearly evident when Sinbad bemoans bad choices he has made in the past. Also, the stories consistently value cleverness. In virtually every story, Sinbad demonstrates ingenuity when he gets into trouble, and his ingenuity usually saves the day. For example, in the fourth story, Sinbad is buried alive in a cavern with his dead wife as part of a strange island custom. When a husband or wife dies, his or her spouse is entombed with them. Sinbad saves himself when another woman is buried alive in the same cavern with her dead husband. He explains, "Then I arose, and taking in my hand a long bone of a dead man, I went to the woman, and I struck her upon the middle of the head, whereupon she fell down senseless, and I struck her a second and a third time, and she died. So I took her bread and what else she had, and I found upon her abundance of ornaments and apparel, necklaces and jewels and minerals. And having taken the water and food that was with her, I sat in a place that I had prepared in a side of the cavern wherein to sleep. And I proceeded to eat a little of that food, as much only as would sustain me, lest it should be exhausted quickly, and I should die of hunger and thirst. I remained in that cavern a length of time, and whenever they buried a corpse, I killed the person who was buried with it alive, and took that person's food and drink to subsist upon it." Sinbad never second-guesses this morally ambiguous strategy. Instead, the story simply recounts his ability to get out of a seemingly impossible situation. Eventually, Sinbad discovers a way out of the cavern, and he takes the gold and jewels that had been buried with previous victims home with him. Once again, Sinbad survives a potentially deadly ordeal, and he returns home wealthier than when he left. The Sinbad adventures almost all end with a refrain designed to remind you that you're listening to Scheherazade trying to save her own life. Almost every Sinbad story ends with the phrase, "This then is the story of my voyage, and tomorrow, if it be the will of God, whose name be exalted, you shall come back, and I will tell you the story of the next voyage." The enticement to hear another story always works. The listener is reminded that Scheherazade is acting as a bard, and along with the king, the listener is left wanting more. One other point about Sinbad's adventures. They include references to real locations, such as Baghdad, Basra, and the Sea of India, enough so that many folks have tried to map out his travels. You can actually find various proposed maps of his adventures on the web, and you'll even find one on a postage stamp celebrating the Sultan of Oman. The Adventures of Sinbad, like other stories in the 1001 Nights collection, are interesting beyond their entertainment value, because they tell us something about the cultural customs and the values of the Middle East of long ago. Sinbad praises Allah repeatedly for his good fortune. Allah is the one true God, and He is the source of all good things. Those who lead a godly life are rewarded, and those who do not quickly fall into ruin. The stories of Sinbad also make it clear that hospitality to strangers was important, and there was a certain code of honor required of travelers. Frequently, Sinbad is separated from his wealth when catastrophes strike. He's always brought back to his wealth later, and when this happens, honorable men have kept it in safekeeping for him, instead of stealing it for themselves. In fact, Sinbad gets in trouble a few times when the men holding his valuables don't recognize him, and they accuse him of trying to steal the wealth of another man. Finally, Sinbad displays remarkable ingenuity and presence of mind in incredibly dangerous situations. He's the consummate operator of the ancient Middle East, fashioning armor and weapons out of nothing and figuring out how to escape danger when it seems impossible. There are negative cultural elements too, of course. Women are treated like property, and evil men and monsters are always black or dark. Dark skin color becomes code to signal that someone is foreign, untrustworthy, uncivilized, and often not too bright. My daughter has commented that the Disney versions of the 1001 Night stories often revise the old stories in an attempt to eliminate the sexism and ethnocentrism that appeared in the original. In addition to the well-known adventures of Sinbad, Aladdin, and Ali Baba, the 1001 Nights collection also includes themes or motifs that we see developed in later European fairy tales. For example, many scholars argue that threads of the Cinderella story can be found in several of the Arabian Nights tales that show a younger step-sibling, either a woman or a man, treated badly by older step-siblings. The Second Sheikh story, The Eldest Lady's Tale, and Abdullah ibn Fadl and his brothers all describe younger siblings harassed by two older brothers or sisters. In some of these, the siblings are female, while in others, they're male. And sometimes there's a happy ending, as in Cinderella. But in other stories, the good sibling doesn't fare so well. One of the tales, Judar and his brethren, ends with the younger brother being poisoned by his elder brothers. It's a good reminder that 1001 Nights has a dark side, much like the original Brothers Grimm collection of old European folk tales. Another story, The Ruined Man Who Became Rich Again Through a Dream, also appears in many other cultures, and it includes a common folktale motif. According to the story, a wealthy man suddenly becomes destitute. In a dream, he's told to leave his hometown of Baghdad and travel to Cairo, where he will find treasure. Eagerly, he heads off to the city, but he runs into trouble after trouble, and he's left completely impoverished and must spend the night curled up beside a local mosque. He's attacked there, nearly beaten to death by a gang of thugs, until the police rescue him and bring him to the jail. Despondent and a little bit embarrassed, he tells his dream to the policeman at the jail. The policeman laughs at him and then describes his own dream. "I dreamed," the policeman says, "that there's a house in Baghdad where a vast fortune is buried under the fountain in the courtyard. But," he boasts, "I'm not foolish enough to travel hundreds of miles to follow a dream." The poor man recognizes his own home in the policeman's description. He goes back to his own home in Baghdad and digs up the treasure buried in his own front courtyard. This story uses the self-fulfilling dream or self-fulfilling prophecy technique, a common storytelling technique in mythology. The protagonist is told that something will happen to him. This new awareness leads him to actions that he would not have performed otherwise, actions that lead to the fulfillment of the dream or the prophecy. Think of Oedipus and the prophecy that he would kill his father and sleep with his mother. The story of the ruined man and the dream in the 1001 Nights collection uses this same technique, and it appears over and over in classic European folk literature. 1001 Nights also includes stories with mythical, imaginary creatures. Aladdin, of course, conjures up the most famous Arabian mythical creature, the genie or jinn. Jinns are common characters in Persian folk tales, appearing in pre-Islamic Arabian literature. They're not inherently good or evil, they're magical, and they can use their powers to help or to hurt you, so it's always best to stay on a jinn's good side. The story of Ali the Cairene and the haunted house in Baghdad includes a house haunted by jinns. Ali, the protagonist in the story, strays off the godly path laid out by Allah, and he ends up destitute. He travels from his home in Cairo to Baghdad, where he comes upon a house that sits empty. The locals try to warn him away from the home, explaining that every man who has tried to spend the night there has been dead by morning. Ali, who has lost everything, still asks to spend the night, hoping that death will come and bring him some peace. Instead, a jinn speaks to him in the night, calling out, "O Ali, son of Hassan, instruct me. Shall I send you down the gold?" Ali is surprised to be called by name, but he answers. He's told that each night the jinns called out this same question, but in the past, other men fled the house in fear, tripping down the stairs in their haste to escape the jinns and breaking their necks. Ali, however, is destined to receive the gold. Ali's fortunes turn at this point. He bargains with the jinn to have his wealth restored and his family brought to him by means of a jinn guiding them in a magic ride in the middle of the night. From that point forward, Ali increases in prosperity, and the story culminates with his son marrying the king's daughter and being appointed as the king's successor. The Arabian Nights stories are chock full of fantastic elements like jinns, including mermaids, serpents who surround entire islands, enormous birds who sit on eggs the size of buildings, and flying carpets. These attracted Western European writers in the 1700s and 1800s to the tales. As Western European culture began to see itself as rational and scientific, it somewhat self-servingly characterized Middle Eastern culture as irrational, exotic, emotional, and fantastic. 1001 Nights reinforced this caricature, especially after 1704, when Antoine Galland's French translation first popularized the anthology. But it seems that the appeal of the stories won out over stereotypes in the end. Modern British writer A.S. Byatt states that the Arabian Nights collection came to stand for the wonderful against the mundane, the imaginative against the prosaically and reductively rational. 1001 Nights ends with a dramatic conclusion. Finally, Scheherazade runs out of stories to tell. Sir Richard Burton's 19th century translation describes this moment at the end of the collection. Now during this time, Scheherazade had borne the king 3 sons. So when she had made an end of the story, she rose to her feet, and kissing the ground before him, she said, "O king of the time and unique one of the age and the tide, I am your handmaid. These 1,000 nights and a night I have entertained you with stories of folk gone before, and admonitory instances of the men of yesteryear. May I then make bold and ask a favor of your highness?" The king replies, "Ask, O Scheherazade, and it shall be granted to you." Whereupon she cried out to the nurses and the eunuchs, saying, "Bring me my children." So they brought them to her in haste, and they were 3 boy children, one walking, one crawling, and one suckling. She took them, and setting them before the king, again kissed the ground and said, "O king of the age, these are your children, and I beg that you would release me from the fate of death as a gift to these infants. For if you kill me, they will become motherless and will find no one among women to raise them as they should be raised." When the king heard this, he wept, and straining the boys to his chest, he said, "By Allah, O Scheherazade, I pardoned you long before the coming of these children, because I found you chaste, pure, ingenuous, and pious. May Allah bless you and your father and your mother and your root and your branch. I take the Almighty as witness against me that I exempt you from anything that could harm you." The story ends on a happy note. Scheherazade is celebrated publicly, given beautiful dresses to wear, and the king commands that her stories be recorded for posterity. The reader can also confidently conclude that the kingdom became safe for young virgins once again. However, it's still a disturbing story when you think about it. An entire kingdom is thrown into peril because a ruler becomes outraged at his wife's unfaithfulness. This isn't a unique story. If you know the book of Esther in the Bible, you'll see the similarities. Like the Arabian Nights, the book of Esther begins with a Persian king who has been betrayed by his wife, not by sexual infidelity, but by public humiliation. Basically, the king's wife refuses to come to him when he calls for her during a large banquet. He's humiliated and he doesn't take it well. The king's wife is banished from his presence, never again to come before him. In order to satisfy his sexual appetites, young virgins in the kingdom are brought to him one by one, spending one night with him, and then being sent to live with the king's eunuchs. This continues until Esther is brought to him. Esther is Jewish, but the king isn't aware of this. The story takes a bit of a different turn at this point, but it's clear from both Esther and Scheherazade's stories that women in the ancient Persian Empire were at the mercy of the men in their lives, particularly their husbands and their kings. We find cautionary tales about unfaithful women, often enough that it makes you wonder just how big a problem this was. But at least in 1001 Nights, Scheherazade is able to make things right. I opened this lecture arguing that 1001 Nights should be understood as mythology, with the term mythology interpreted broadly. The collection as a whole doesn't focus on the nature and activities of the gods, as in Greek or Roman mythology, but then this is a different world than Greece or Rome. 1001 Nights emerges from and reflects a world charged with supernatural elements and activity. It also explores fundamental questions about how men and women are to act in the world, what's expected of them socially and morally. Think about Sinbad. The prompt for the entire cycle of Sinbad stories is one poor man's complaint that the world is unjust. Sinbad's adventures aren't meant merely to entertain this young man, but to instruct him about the nature of the world and what a man's options are in that world. Similarly, the overarching story about Scheherazade is an extended meditation on a king's rash behavior and the tools available to a vulnerable young woman to stop that behavior. We are all Scheherazade's king, and we are all simultaneously Sinbad's young, poor errand boy, struggling to wield power justly when we have it, and to find power when we feel powerless. This body of mythology tells us the nature of the world we occupy and provides us with a metaphorical map for navigating that world, whether we travel to the ends of the earth or live out our days at home. One final note. It might interest you to know that Edgar Allan Poe wrote a final chapter to this anthology in his story, The 1002nd Tale of Scheherazade, written in 1845. In this story, Sinbad the sailor goes on one final 8th adventure. In this adventure, Scheherazade describes events from Poe's lifetime. But the ancient king listening to Scheherazade can't wrap his brain around all the unsettling images Scheherazade describes. He finally becomes so disgusted with the story that he stomps off, and he has Scheherazade executed the very next day. Now, I actually love the fact that the Arabian Nights stories prompted a spin-off like Pose. It reinforces exactly the point that Scheherazade is making throughout her stories, and the main point of this lecture series. Great stories are powerful. They can be life-giving, or they can be deadly. They can inspire men and women to great achievements and heroism, or they can bring out the absolute worst in us. 1001 Nights, despite the fact that it includes ironic twists, bawdy sexual romps, and humorous satire, takes storytelling very seriously. It presents storytelling as a life or death proposition. Despite Disney's Aladdin movie, storytelling isn't kid stuff. So keep this in mind the next time someone asks you to tell a story.